Joining me now is journalist and author of Second Class, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women, Batya Ungar-Sargon. Welcome back to the program. We're starting with some good news. The June jobs report came in stronger than expected with 147,000 new jobs added. But if you look a little bit deeper, the full picture of what has happened in the job market since Donald Trump became president, since he began his second term, well, the picture that emerges there is quite extraordinary.
Gains since the start of President Trump's second term, increasing by over 2 million jobs, while the number of foreign-born workers has declined by more than 540,000.
That paints quite the picture. More than 2 million new jobs for native-born Americans. What has that meant for the American economy, Batya?
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be back here with you. Yeah, it turns out they actually were taking our jobs. For 5 years, I've been making this argument that illegal migrants are undercutting the wages of working class Americans. There's this narrative on the left that they're taking jobs that Americans will not do or don't want to do. And it's absolute nonsense. There's not a single industry in the United States that's done by a majority illegal migrant labor. The highest rates are about 30% in agriculture, which means 72% of people working farms are American citizens. And it is just so disgusting to say these are jobs that are beneath an American. Turns out Americans don't think that. When you have mass deportations and a closed border, employers have to pay more wages. And guess what? Americans are happy to take those jobs.
And yet with those increased in wages, and we have seen real wages go up, the inflation number has remained low. In fact, it's fallen. And at a time when we were told tariffs were going to see skyrocketing inflation. So much of the economic expertise that we've heard from in recent months, in recent years, has come out completely wrong. They have just been disproven almost immediately.
That is 100% true. And of course, those of us who said from the beginning the tariffs are not going to be inflationary feel pretty good about ourselves. I'm sure President Trump does as well. And it's so amazing, Rita, because what you're seeing here is, he had his first term. He learned a lot about how Washington works or doesn't work, right? He learned a lot about how there are going to be people who are going to be naysayers, who are going to try to stymie him. But he had a theory of the case for how to improve the lives of working class Americans. And what we're seeing right now is him just making good again and again and again on that theory. The entire economic expert class was against this from the get-go and warned that everything he is doing was going to cause massive inflation. And it turned out that every single one of them was wrong, and Donald Trump was right. And he's been talking about this for 40 years, about how tariffs actually improve the lot of working class people in so many different ways. So it's so tremendous to see this really just all of the predictions were wrong. And what he had promised the American people was going to work actually worked.
But the elites aren't giving up on this fight. We know they are determined to have this almost permanent underclass of workers, illegal immigrants who they can pay, I'm not using hyperbole here, but pay essentially slave wages to. And they're not letting go of that, Batya. They want that comfort. They want it. That's worked well for them. It's not worked well for the average American worker, but for the top few percent of the economy, it has worked well.
Yeah, absolutely. The downward mobility of the American working class is due to a number of factors, but the massive increase in illegal labor is one of the biggest ones. You look at the 1970s, which is when working class Americans could really afford to support a family in dignity on a single income. The share of the population that was foreign born in America was 4%. You look today and it's over 15%. And of course, if you're here and you're an illegal migrant, you have two options. Either you're working, which means you're driving down the wages that an American worker could have asked for if you weren't there competing with them for a job, or you're living off the social welfare state, right? There's no third option here. And both of those are utterly, utterly unacceptable. And yet the elites in both parties, as you rightly point out, Rita, have been very much enjoying this because they are the consumers of low wage labor. So, of course, they would rather pay a nanny $40,000 a year under the table than pay an American $70,000 a year and give them benefits. And Donald Trump has simply put his foot down and said, no more. And as a result, we're seeing real wages rise for working class Americans, and the elites are going crazy because they cannot stand to be deprived of their slave labor force. That's what all of this, activism against ICE and against the deportations is about. They say they're coming for our communities, and what they mean is they're coming for our cheap workforce.
That is so well put. And I think a lot of the money behind these protests is motivated by just that. Now, this is an astonishing story. Joe Biden's doctor has pleaded the fifth. That's the right against self-incrimination. Dr. Kevin O'Connor is really refusing to cooperate with a congressional investigation into Joe Biden's health while he was president. And he decided to answer questions. He declined to answer questions during the deposition. The New York Post is reporting that his longtime physician was asked two key questions. Were you ever told to lie about the president's health? And did you ever believe President Biden was unfit to execute his duties? In both instances, Batya, he pleaded the fifth. To me, that is astonishing.
It's so totally crazy. I was sitting there thinking, like, what crime does he think he might have committed? And did Joe Biden actually, stiff him of a pardon? I mean, he was giving out all these preemptive pardons. Apparently, his doctor thinks he might have committed a crime. Maybe he needed one too. It's so crazy what we just went through. I mean, the epic, massive gaslighting. I continue to think, Rita, that the real story here is the media's complicity. Because, to me, it makes a lot of sense that Jill Biden would have lied about her husband. It makes a lot of sense that his inner circle would have. The problem was not that people who were benefiting from him being in this position lied about him. The problem is that there was no media, except the conservative media, willing to hold them to account. And what we learned from this was that the mainstream liberal corporate media in America is 100% in the can for the Democrats. Like, that is the thing that we really learned here, is that they refused to push on what we could all see was true because they were terrified Donald Trump would win. And that, to me, is the lesson we cannot allow them to forget, especially given the fact that upwards of 90% of American journalists are Democrats. And so this is like the vast majority of journalism in America is on one side politically. This is an epic, epic scandal and remains to me the biggest story here.
Oh, it absolutely is. And those of us who did report on his cognitive decline, reported on incidents where he seemed to be completely lost and incoherent, were accused of pushing fake news and disinformation. So it wasn't just that they declined to report on this, they actively attacked those who did report on it to try to undermine trust in that sort of reporting. So you can see why right now trust in the US media is at record lows. They have completely discredited themselves. We mentioned tariffs earlier, and earlier today, there was a whole round of new tariff announcements. The US is going to be charging a 50% tariff on all Brazilian goods starting on August 1. Other countries impacted by these latest round of announcements include Libya, Iraq, Algeria, Sri Lanka facing a 30% tariff, Moldova and Brunei 25%, and the Philippines will have 20% tax on imports. Now, in Australia, there remains a great deal of doubt about the merits of tariffs. Tell my audience what this policy really means for Americans and particularly American workers.
So, for a very long time, many countries have had tariffs on our goods for very good reason, because tariffs protect your own workers. And so many countries felt, well, we're going to protect our workers. We're not going to allow American imports to flood our markets. But, we will expect to have free access to the American market. And for some reason, the elites gave this to them, because the elites, of course, are the consumers of this stuff, not the producers. And so they wanted these cheap goods from other countries, and they didn't care that the American worker was getting screwed. What a tariff does is it effectively says that the product of the labor of the American worker deserves to be competitive in the global marketplace. That is what the elites had taken away from us because of all of this offshoring to countries where labor is much cheaper because working conditions are much worse. Stuff was artificially made cheap and then flooded the American marketplace so that a manufacturer who's doing the right thing, who's paying an American a living wage, couldn't compete because there was so much cheaper stuff there. And so we had this artificial cheapening of product, especially stuff that you get from China, but also from a host of other countries that when, things started to become clear that China was really undermining us as a country, they moved to other countries. So there were all these other countries that are effectively a back door into our economy that the Chinese simply set up shop there in order to evade the tariffs that we had on them. That's why we need these tariffs. We have to protect our workers. We have to protect the product of their labor. We have to protect their dignity. And what's so amazing, Rita, is that a lot of working class people said, you know what? Things might get more expensive, but if that means that my kid has a better shot at a better future at the American dream, I'm happy to pay that. It was just an added bonus that it turned out that the tariffs were not inflationary. It turned out that there were a lot of things that made it expensive to bring things from China, like the fuel or the shipping, the entire supply chain. There are a lot of places where you can actually pull back some of those costs if you're willing to reshore manufacturing. But at the end of the day, the thing that your audience needs to understand is it wasn't fair to our workers. The American working class was paying the cost for the immense prosperity that other countries and the elites in our country were generating on their backs, and they were seeing none of the benefits. And it was just not fair anymore, and we had to turn it around.
And it's an issue Donald Trump has been talking about for decades, long before he had any political aspirations, and he campaigned on it. No one should be shocked that he's implementing these policies. Now, the Trump administration did have a big win at the Supreme Court this week. It was an 8-1 decision. The Supreme Court lifted the order blocking the Trump administration from enforcing large-scale firings of federal workers. But there was one dissenting judge, not surprisingly, again, Ketanji Brown Jackson. This is, again, very surprising because you got even the leftist judges like Sotomayor and Kagan siding with the Trump administration. But Brown Jackson, again, saw things differently.
Yes, she seems to think that it is the Supreme Court's job to legislate, which of course it isn't. So there seems to be a real fundamental misunderstanding. And while obviously, if the Trump administration ignored a Supreme Court ruling, that would be a problem. That has not happened yet. They have abided by all of the rulings. But nobody wants to talk about what happens when the judiciary branch fundamentally misunderstands its role and thinks that it should have the ability to actually put a halt to things that are solidly in the executive branch. I'll just give you one example. I think most people don't realize immigration is pretty much at the discretion of the president. Not just that, but immigration judges are not part of the judicial branch. they answer to the president. They are part of the executive branch. They are just basically executives there to answer to what the president sets out as the policy and to rule on what are effectively administrative hearings. And so it is such a misnomer to suggest that illegal migrants should have access to the same due process rights that we as American citizens have. They have a much lower standard of due process rights. And to mistake immigration judges for part of the judiciary, the way so many judges are doing in this very self-interested way, that too is a huge constitutional crisis, in my opinion.
Batya Ungar-Sargon, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you so much, Rita. God bless.